Welcome back. There's a specific kind of pain that doesn't look dramatic on the outside, but it quietly controls decisions because it makes a person return to what already hurt them, even after they promised themselves they were done, even after they said never again, even after they finally saw the pattern clearly. It shows up as a message that shouldn't be sent, but still gets typed. It shows up as a profile that shouldn't be checked, but still gets visited. It shows up as that moment late at night when the mind suddenly starts rewriting the past, softening the red flags, magnifying the good moments, and turning the same story into a different one, just enough to justify going back. And the most confusing part is that it can happen even when the person knows the truth, because the mind can understand something is unhealthy and still feel pulled toward it, like logic is standing there watching while something older takes control. People usually call that love or loneliness or weakness, but those words don't explain why going back can feel almost automatic, like a loop, like a reflex, like a craving. If it was only love, then clarity would stop it. If it was only loneliness, then company would fix it. If it was only weakness, then willpower would be enough. But it isn't. What's happening is more mechanical than romantic and more psychological than personal. Because the brain doesn't only attach to people, it attaches to emotional patterns. It attaches to relief, to familiarity, to the hope of finally getting the ending it didn't get, and sometimes it even attaches to the version of the person that existed for a short time, the version that felt safe, the version that made everything feel possible. That's why the pull can feel stronger after pain, not weaker, because pain doesn't always create distance. Sometimes pain creates unfinished business, and unfinished business keeps the mind engaged, like a song that stops before the last note, leaving the nervous system waiting for completion. And this is where most people get trapped, because they think the problem is that they miss them. So they fight the missing, they fight the feeling, they fight themselves, and the more they fight, the more attention the loop receives, and the stronger it becomes. This video is not about blaming anyone. And it's not about pretending feelings don't matter. It's about explaining the hidden reason people keep going back in a way that removes shame, removes confusion, and replaces it with clarity. Because once the mechanism is understood, the loop becomes easier to break. The pull is not always a sign of love. Sometimes it's the brain chasing relief. Sometimes it's the mind chasing a fantasy bond. Sometimes it's the nervous system addicted to inconsistency. Sometimes it's identity returning to familiar pain because it feels normal. And by the end of this video, the pattern will make sense. And that alone changes the power it has, because the moment the loop is named, it stops feeling like destiny and starts feeling like something that can be unlearned. Now the first step is simple, but it changes everything. The question isn't, why do they still affect me? The question is, what exactly is the brain trying to get back when it keeps pulling me toward them? The first thing to understand is that the brain does not only attach to people, it attaches to regulation, because human connection is one of the fastest ways the nervous system learns to calm down. And once the body associates a specific person with relief, the desire to return stops being purely emotional and starts becoming biological. This is why going back can feel irrational, because it isn't driven by logic. It is driven by a learned link between that person and a shift in internal state, where anxiety lowered, loneliness softened, stress quieted, or self-doubt disappeared for a moment. When that link forms, the mind can label it love, but the body often experiences it as relief, and relief is addictive when life has been heavy. In many cases, the return is not motivated by the relationship as a whole, but by the memory of a specific feeling that happened inside it, like the calm after a call, the warmth after a message, the safety after reassurance, or even the brief moment when attention made everything feel stable. When the present becomes stressful, the nervous system reaches for the fastest shortcut it remembers, and that shortcut can be a person, even if that person also brought pain, inconsistency, or confusion. This is why people can miss someone who treated them poorly, because the brain is not asking, was this good for me? It is asking, did this ever soothe me? If the answer is yes, then the body can crave the relief while the mind remembers the damage. And that internal conflict is exactly what makes the cycle feel so exhausting. A simple way to see this clearly is to notice the timing of the urge to go back. The urge often rises when the nervous system is already dysregulated, when sleep is off, when stress is high, when loneliness increases, when boredom appears, or when life feels uncertain. In those moments, going back doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like a solution, because the brain is not searching for a person, it is searching for a state, and it believes that state exists on the other side of that connection. This also explains why closure conversations often fail. People assume closure will calm the mind, but the mind is already calm when it imagines the conversation, and then it becomes activated again the moment contact happens. And now instead of closure there is stimulation, and stimulation strengthens attachment. The loop becomes: contact creates emotion, emotion creates urgency, urgency creates meaning, and meaning creates the feeling that something important is still unfinished, even if nothing productive is happening. The Stoic way to approach this is not to shame the pull and not to glorify it, but to label it accurately, because accurate labeling reduces its power. When the urge appears, it can be seen as a nervous system craving for regulation rather than proof of destiny. And the moment the mind stops calling it love automatically, it becomes easier to sit with it without obeying it. This is also why replacement strategies work only when they replace the function, not the person. If the person was used as a stress regulator, then the new habit must regulate stress. If the person was used as a loneliness anesthetic, then the new structure must reduce isolation. If the person was used as a self-worth boost, then self-worth must be rebuilt internally rather than borrowed. Otherwise, the body will keep returning to the old shortcut, because the need still exists and the brain still remembers where it once found relief quickly. So the hidden reason people keep going back, at the deepest level, is often simple and uncomfortable, because it suggests the problem is not just the relationship, it is the regulation. It is the nervous system seeking relief. And once that is understood, the next question becomes obvious. Because if the body is craving relief, then why does it crave it from someone who is inconsistent, unpredictable, and sometimes painful? That answer is even more revealing, because inconsistency does something to the brain that consistency rarely does. It creates obsession. The second layer is harder to admit, because it feels personal, but it is also one of the most common reasons people return, which is that the mind does not always miss the person as they are. It often misses the meaning the person represented, and it misses the version of the story that almost happened. This is what creates the fantasy bond, where attachment is held together by possibility rather than reality, and where the memory that pulls the mind back is not the full relationship, but the highlights, the rare tenderness, the beginning, the apology, the good day that made everything feel reparable, and the small moments that suggested a future that never fully arrived. In that bond, the mind becomes selective, not because it wants to be fooled, but because it wants to protect hope, and hope feels like safety when life is felt uncertain. The mind starts focusing on who they were sometimes, and it starts ignoring who they were most of the time. And then it begins treating inconsistency as a temporary phase rather than a pattern. This is why people can say they're not a bad person and mean it sincerely, while still feeling exhausted, anxious, and emotionally unstable in the dynamic, because the mind is protecting a narrative that keeps the heart attached, even when the nervous system is repeatedly saying that something is not safe. The fantasy bond is also fueled by the desire to complete the story. When something ends without clarity, the mind experiences that as unfinished, and unfinished experiences keep attention locked, because the brain prefers closure, even if closure is painful. It is not unusual for someone to return simply to try to correct the ending, to try to get a different outcome, to try to turn confusion into certainty, and to try to transform a painful chapter into something that feels meaningful. This is why the mind replays the past, because replaying creates the illusion of control. If the mind can find the right explanation, the right mistake, the right detail that should have been different, then it feels like the future can be controlled as well, and returning begins to feel like an opportunity to prove something, to fix something, or to finally earn what was once promised indirectly. But the fantasy bond is not built on the present. It is built on an image, and images are powerful because they do not argue back. The image of someone at their best is easy to laugh. The image of a relationship, if only, is easy to crave. The image of being chosen fully, consistently, and proudly is easy to chase. The pain begins when the mind confuses that image with the person, because the person is real, and real patterns are what create real stability. A simple way to test whether the attachment is to the person or to the fantasy is to look at what is being missed, because often what is missed is not their character, not their reliability, not their daily presence, but a certain feeling that existed in the beginning, or the emotional high of being wanted, or the sense of possibility that made life feel open. When those are the main things being missed, the attachment is not to reality. It is to symbolism, and symbolism can be incredibly addictive, because symbolism turns a person into a mirror, and that mirror reflects a desired identity. It reflects being valued, being chosen, being understood, being important, being special, and once someone has felt that reflection, it becomes difficult to let it go, even when the relationship itself is unstable. The fantasy bond also keeps people returning through the belief that leaving would mean admitting that it was never real, and that belief creates resistance, because the mind does not want to accept wasted effort, and it does not want to accept that hope was misplaced. So instead, it chooses a softer conclusion, where one more attempt could finally make it right, and one more conversation could finally make it clear, and one more return could finally create the version that was imagined. The Stoic approach here is not to become cynical, but to become accurate, because accuracy protects peace. Accuracy asks for the pattern, not the promise. Accuracy asks for the present, not the potential. Accuracy asks for what is consistent, not what is possible. Once this is practiced, the mind starts to detach from fantasy and return to observation, and when observation becomes dominant, the attachment begins to weaken naturally, because the bond was being fed by imagination more than by reality. However, even when fantasy is removed, another force can still keep people trapped, and it is one of the strongest forces in human behavior, because it is not about meaning, it is about reward. Inconsistency does not only create confusion, inconsistency creates addiction, and that is the next layer, because the brain does not get obsessed when reward is steady. It gets obsessed when reward is unpredictable. The third layer is where the pull becomes almost chemical, because the brain is not only responding to emotion or meaning, it is responding to reward patterns. An unpredictable reward is one of the strongest patterns the human nervous system can attach to. When attention is consistent, the mind can relax, because it knows what to expect, and it doesn't have to scan constantly for signs of danger or loss. When attention is inconsistent, the mind becomes alert, because uncertainty creates hyperfocus, and hyperfocus creates obsession, and that obsession often gets misread as love, even though it functions more like fixation. This is why someone can feel calm with a stable person and still feel more excited with an unstable person, because the excitement is not romance, it is arousal created by unpredictability. And unpredictability forces the brain to monitor, to interpret, to wait, to guess, and to trace, which keeps the person mentally present even when they are physically absent. A simple example makes it obvious. When someone is always kind, always consistent, always clear, the mind says, "This is safe," and it does not need to think about it every hour. When someone is warm one day and distant the next, the mind says, "Something changed," and now attention gets locked, because the brain wants to solve what changed, and it starts scanning memories, analyzing tone, comparing messages, and looking for the moment where the shift happened. That scanning becomes the habit becomes attachment, and attachment becomes the feeling of being unable to let go. Inconsistency also creates a powerful illusion of value, because rare attention feels more precious than available attention, and when something is given only sometimes, the mind treats it as scarce, and scarcity makes people invest more, not less. The strange part is that the brain can begin to treat the rare good moments as proof that the relationship is real, while treating the frequent painful moments as temporary glitches, and that mental distortion keeps the loop alive. This is why the apology after distance can feel intoxicating. This is why the sweet message after silence can feel like the world is normal again. This is why a brief moment of closeness after weeks of confusion can feel like salvation. Those moments do not just feel good, they feel like relief from tension, and relief after tension is stronger than pleasure without tension. Over time, the relationship stops being about connection and starts being about regulation through highs and lows. The low creates anxiety, the anxiety creates chasing, the chase creates hope, and the hope creates patience, and then a small high arrives, and the brain learns the lesson, which is that chasing works sometimes, and sometimes is enough to train addiction. That is the cruel design of intermittent reward, because it does not need to work every time. It only needs to work occasionally to keep behavior repeating, and the mind becomes trapped in a cycle where it is constantly trying to earn the next good moment, as if the next good moment will finally stabilize everything. This is also why leaving can feel like withdrawal rather than sadness, because withdrawal is what happens when the nervous system has been trained to expect a spike, a message, a call, a return, and when that spike does not arrive, the body experiences discomfort, restlessness, and an urge to fix the feeling by re-establishing contact. Many people interpret this discomfort as proof that the person was special, but the Stoic interpretation is more precise, because precision reduces suffering. The discomfort is not necessarily proof of destiny. It is proof of conditioning. It is proof that the nervous system has learned a pattern and is now demanding the familiar stimulus. This is where the discipline of naming becomes crucial again, because naming turns unconscious compulsion into conscious awareness. When the urge to go back appears, it can be labeled as a craving for a reward cycle rather than a signal that something meaningful is being missed. That label does not erase emotion, but it prevents emotion from being romanticized into a reason to return. Breaking this layer requires removing reinforcement, because addiction weakens when the pattern stops being rewarded. This is why partial contact often keeps the loop alive, because it continues the unpredictability. A small reply, a quick check, a short conversation, a casual, "How are you?" can reactivate the cycle by delivering another unpredictable reward, and the nervous system resets into waiting mode again. This is also why healing usually feels boring at first, because stability does not create spikes. A calm routine does not create that sharp relief feeling. A consistent environment does not create those dramatic emotional swings. The brain may interpret boredom as something is missing, but what is actually missing is stimulation. And stimulation is not the same as love. The goal is not to kill emotion, but to retrain the nervous system to experience calm as safety, not as emptiness, and to experience consistency as attraction, not as a lack of excitement. Once this layer is understood, the question changes again, because the mind can finally see why leaving feels difficult even when the relationship was painful. And yet one deeper layer still remains, because the brain doesn't only attach to reward patterns and fantasy bonds. It also attaches to familiarity, even when familiarity is painful. And that is where identity quietly pulls a person back, not to what is good, but to what feels normal. The final layer is often the quietest one, and for that reason it is the most difficult to recognize, because it does not feel dramatic or chemical. It feels familiar, and familiarity has a powerful gravity, especially when it matches old beliefs about the self. Human beings do not only move toward pleasure, they move toward what feels normal, and what feels normal is usually shaped long before any specific relationship begins. If someone grew up feeling unseen, inconsistent attention may feel strangely recognizable. If someone learned early that love must be earned, dynamics that require effort and proving may feel natural. If someone internalized the belief that they are too much or not enough, relationships that confirm that tension can feel aligned with identity, even if they are painful. This is why leaving certain people feels like leaving a part of oneself, because the dynamic is not just about the other person. It is about a self-image that found validation inside that pattern. Even when the validation was negative, it was familiar. Even when the treatment was inconsistent, it matched an internal narrative, and the mind tends to return to narratives it already understands. Familiar pain can feel safer than unfamiliar peace, because peace requires a new identity, and a new identity requires uncertainty. Pain that matches a long-held belief feels predictable, and predictability creates a strange sense of control. If someone believes deep down that relationships are unstable, then instability confirms the belief and reduces cognitive tension. If someone believes they must fight for affection, then struggle confirms that identity and makes the dynamic feel real. Breaking that layer requires more than distance from a person. It requires distance from the belief that made the dynamic feel acceptable in the first place. The question shifts from "why do I miss them?" to "what part of me feels at home in this pattern?" And that question is uncomfortable because it moves responsibility inward without blaming, and it exposes the way identity participates in repetition. This is where self-respect becomes a practice rather than a concept. If the belief is "I am only valued when I overgive," then practicing measured effort rewires identity. If the belief is "I am easily replaced," then practicing standards and walking away from inconsistency challenges that narrative. If the belief is "I must tolerate confusion to keep connection," then choosing clarity over comfort begins to reshape what feels normal. At first, unfamiliar peace can feel empty because the nervous system is used to stimulation, unpredictability, and emotional swings. Stability may feel boring, and clarity may feel less intense than longing. But intensity is not depth, and chaos is not passion. Over time, the mind adjusts, and what once felt dull begins to feel safe, and what once felt safe begins to look unstable. This is the real turning point, because the cycle does not break when someone disappears from a life. It breaks when the identity that accepted the pattern evolves. Once self-image shifts from "I hope they choose me" to "I choose what aligns with me," the gravitational pull weakens naturally, not through force, but through mismatch. The hidden reason people keep going back is rarely just about love. It is about relief, fantasy, unpredictable reward, and familiar identity, layered together in a way that feels deeply personal, but is often deeply patterned. When those layers are seen clearly, shame dissolves, because the behavior stops looking irrational and starts looking conditioned. And once conditioning is understood, it can be changed. The final step is not dramatic, and it is not loud. It is a quiet decision to tolerate the discomfort of growth instead of the familiarity of pain, to sit with craving without romanticizing it, to allow peace to feel unfamiliar until it becomes natural, and to build an identity that no longer finds home in instability. That is how the loop ends, not by fighting feelings, but by outgrowing the pattern that kept them alive. And this is where everything begins to shift, because once the pattern is fully understood, the focus can finally move from analysis to action, and action is what turns awareness into freedom. Breaking the loop does not require dramatic declarations, emotional speeches, or symbolic final messages that attempt to close every chapter perfectly, because closure is not something that is granted by another person. It is something that is constructed internally through discipline and consistency. The rail break begins when reinforcement stops completely, not partially, and when the nervous system is given enough uninterrupted time to recalibrate without spikes of stimulation that reactivate the attachment. Distance is not about punishment, and it is not about pride. It is about allowing the brain to unlearn what it has been trained to expect. When contact continues in small doses, even casually, the pattern remains alive, because unpredictability continues feeding the reward cycle. When distance is clear and consistent, the system slowly stops anticipating relief from that specific source, and anticipation is what keeps attachment active. At the same time, something else must be built, because removing a habit without replacing its function leaves a void, and the void is where relapse usually begins. If the person was being used to regulate stress, then new structures must regulate stress. If the person was being used to escape loneliness, then new environments must reduce isolation. If the person was being used to boost self-worth, then internal discipline and external achievement must rebuild that worth in a stable way. This is why growth often feels uncomfortable in the beginning, because it requires tolerating the absence of what once provided instant relief while building slower, more reliable sources of stability. The mind may interpret that phase as emptiness or boredom, but what is actually happening is recalibration, and recalibration always feels strange before it feels strong. Another critical shift happens when the narrative changes from loss to alignment. Instead of viewing the end of the dynamic as something that was taken away, it can be reframed as something that no longer match evolving standards. When standards increase, certain patterns automatically become incompatible, and incompatibility is not tragedy, it is clarity. There is also power in accepting that longing does not equal destiny. Longing is a feeling, and feelings can exist without commanding action. The presence of desire does not require obedience, and the presence of memory does not require return. A person can miss someone and still choose distance. A person can feel craving and still honor discipline. That separation between feeling and action is the final proof of emotional independence. Over time, something subtle but profound begins to happen. The urge weakens not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer fed. The fantasy loses color because it is not revisited. The reward cycle fades because it is not reinforced. The identity shifts because new behaviors are practiced repeatedly, and eventually, what once felt magnetic begins to feel misaligned. This is the quiet victory that does not look dramatic from the outside. There are no grand announcements and no visible transformation, but internally there is stability, and that stability creates a different presence. Decisions become cleaner, standards become firmer, attachment becomes a choice rather than a reflex. At that point, going back no longer feels tempting, because the version of the self who would have returned has evolved. The attraction to instability fades, not through force, but through growth. The mind stops chasing relief from familiar pain and starts choosing peace that once felt unfamiliar. That is the real ending of the cycle. Not forgetting them, not hating them, not pretending it never mattered, but understanding the mechanism so clearly that the pattern can no longer hide behind emotion, and choosing alignment over repetition until the pole disappears on its own.